Tell us what you're doing vis-a-vis the Assange case.
I made a personal choice not to try to travel in the middle of a global pandemic. It just wasn't something that I wanted to do, and the court made it possible to access the proceedings remotely.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's a little bit of a backstory to it. So I have a lawyer in the UK that helped me make an urgent application to the court before we had any notice whatsoever from this lower court that there were going to be some kind of press access for these proceedings. I mean, we had no idea what they were going to do ahead of time. And so I proactively was making sure they would offer remote video access so that journalists around the world didn't have to travel. I mean, the fact is that if you go to the US State Department website, at least before these proceedings started, it told you to reconsider traveling to the UK. Like, it very literally said, if you're planning to travel, don't travel to the United Kingdom. So I don't know how I could go to these proceedings and cover them safely. I just don't. So I took that seriously, and I'm glad that basically there's at least a dozen or so international journalists that are using this video link to cover who have been able to gain access through this platform.
And why the limit? Is there a bandwidth issue or?
So I think there is a limit. I believe that the way that they do this is to spend the least amount of money on opening up virtual access. But also what you need to understand is that this court, the Judge Vanessa Baretzer, I noticed this when we had what has been deemed a COVID scare that abruptly halted the proceedings. When she had before her the possible future that we would be doing this all virtually, she was very uneasy about it because she wants to be able to exercise the most control over these proceedings at all. She's paranoid that one of us will take a screenshot of a video and share it.
I would do that. I would screen share it the whole time. Just kidding.
Yeah, she's just, doesn't want us to take a picture of James Lewis. I think he's a total arsehole, but like he's like really, this cartoonish, buffoonish kind of a guy that has taken center stage. And I think she's worried that we would be like sharing stuff throughout the whole proceedings, mocking him. This is certainly what I would do if I could share pictures. I wouldn't just be doing it for educational purposes. There's a lot going on in these proceedings in the last week that have been really hard to tolerate, especially from the prosecution.
Yeah. So can you share with us some of that?
Yeah.
I've been really bothered and irritated by this idea that the indictment represents some kind of evidence, and that if the defense team is calling witnesses who don't believe that the indictment is truth, that then they are automatically biased witnesses. And so the judge should not take them seriously. If we want to talk about bias, I mean, clearly the prosecutor is pretty biased. A lot of the defense witnesses so far, it's been the position of the prosecutor that they're not experts and or that they're biased people. And apparently there's some rule in the UK court system that when the defense calls these witnesses, they're supposed to not be totally in the tank for the legal team. And if the judge can tell that they are, they might find that their testimony is worth less, that it's considered less credible. And so, they've had this really odd, bizarre way of trying to make it seem like they aren't legitimate. And that includes, the other thing that's really bothered me is, you probably don't know what this is, but there's something called the Federal Rules of Prosecution. And it's just basically guidelines for how prosecutors should behave so that they don't violate certain ethical codes. And he read that to Trevor Timm, who is the executive director of Freedom of the Press Foundation. His testimony was some of the best in taking on the prosecutor and, what I don't hesitate to call his bullshit talking points. But they were reading these federal rules of prosecution as if this was evidence that you couldn't possibly have a political case here. And, to me, it's like, that's just a document that everyone's expected to follow. It doesn't really say what's happening inside of the Justice Department.
Right.
I mean, it's really lunatic that, you could read. I mean, it'd basically be like reading the rules of a sports game and then saying that like that dictates what's going to happen in any given match between those two teams. It's like, no, not necessarily. So that really has bothered me because we've seen for multiple witnesses, he takes the same approach And obviously, I understand he's going to be hostile to these witnesses. They are trying to undermine the prosecution's case. I mean, just so everyone's clear here as what we're talking about, the extradition proceedings work in such a way that there's not really much that the prosecution has to do. They already are probably going to win extradition. And then the trial that we're having is, okay, the defense, put on your best reasons why the judge should not approve the extradition. So what we're watching is the defense trying to make an attempt to stop the judge from allowing the extradition. That's just how the process is set up.